It was 8:47 p.m. on March 27, 2025, when Denise Harrow pushed through the revolving glass doors of the Pinnacle Luxe Hotel in Omaha, Nebraska, and the world she'd built cracked open like a fault line. She wasn't expecting a parade, no brass band, no staff lining up to kiss her ring, no velvet rope parting like a curtain call. At 48, Denise carried her authority in the quiet cut of her muted green blazer, the worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder, the silent tread of her sneakers against the polished marble floor. She didn't scream CEO, not with her voice, not with her clothes, not with the absence of a flashy entourage barking orders into earpieces. She didn't need to. The building should have screamed it for her. Every beam, every brick, every inch of this place bore her name, her sweat, her story. But tonight it didn't. Tonight it turned its back on her. The lobby shimmered like a showroom for people who'd never known the sting of a bounced check or the ache of a double shift. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, their prisms dancing across dark oak walls like fireflies trapped in glass. The air smelled of lavender and crisp linen, overpriced candles flickering on every table, a scent Denise had handpicked 6 years ago when she'd stood on this very floor, scissors trembling in her grip as she cut the ribbon to open her 5th hotel. She'd built the Pinnacle Luxe chain, 19 properties now, from Seattle's misty shores to Savannah's humid sprawl, to feel like luxury with a heartbeat, a refuge for travelers who wanted warmth over sterile perfection. She'd envisioned a place where a trucker in muddy boots or a single mom with a screaming toddler could walk in and feel seen, not judged. Tonight, that vision felt like a stranger's dream, a ghost slipping through her fingers. Behind the front desk stood Tara Ellis, 22, her blonde ponytail yanked so tight it looked like it might snap, her name tag pinned crookedly to her navy blazer like an afterthought. Neon orange acrylic nails clacked against the keyboard, a staccato rhythm of impatience and boredom that echoed through the quiet lobby. She barely glanced up as Denise approached, her hazel eyes skimming her for half a heartbeat, taking in the sneakers, the lack of a designer purse, the unassuming satchel, before snapping back to the screen with a flicker of dismissal. "Checking in?" Tara asked, her voice flat, already reaching for the rejection script she'd memorized on her first day. Her tone clipped like she was shooing a fly. "Yes," Denise said, her voice warm but edged with steel, a blade wrapped in velvet. "Under Harrow, Denise Harrow." Tara's fingers tapped faster, a flurry of clicks, then froze. She squinted at the monitor, her lips pursing like she'd bitten into a sour grape left too long on the vine. I don't see anything under that name." She leaned back, folding her arms across her chest, her posture a brick wall slamming shut. "We're at full capacity tonight. Guests only. You'd need a confirmed booking." Her words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding, as if Denise were some lost soul who'd wandered in off the street with no business being there. Denise didn't flinch. Her smile held steady, a quiet anchor in the storm brewing around her, but her eyes narrowed, slicing through the dim light like a knife through fog. "That's fine," she said, her voice calm as a still pond before a hurricane. "There's always a suite held open for me." Tara's eyebrow arched, skepticism oozing from her like grease from a diner grill, thick and unmistakable. "Ma'am," she drawled, stretching the word into a challenge, her tone dripping with condescension. "I don't think you get it. We're full. No exceptions unless you're in the system." She tilted her head slightly, her ponytail swinging like a pendulum marking the seconds until Denise gave up and slunk away. It was the kind of voice you'd use on a kid who'd wandered into a store with no money, or a tourist clutching a crumpled map in a language they couldn't read. Pitying, patronizing, final. The air thickened, a silent drumroll building in the space between them. Denise tilted her head, her gaze drifting past Tara to the brass plaque mounted on the wall behind her. Pinnacle Luxe Hotel, a Harrow Enterprises property. Her name wasn't just on a guest list. It was carved into the foundation, etched into the steel beams, woven into the late-night emails she'd sent from a folding chair in a rented office 12 years ago. Her fingers cramped from typing, her eyes burning from too little sleep. She'd poured her soul into this chain. 19 hotels across the country, each one a brick in the fortress she'd built against a world that kept trying to lock her out, to tell her she didn't belong. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her voice dropping to a quiet, unshakable calm that could have stopped a train in its tracks. "I am a guest. And more than that, I own this hotel. Tara blinked. For a split second, her face went blank, like a computer crashing mid-update, her brain rebooting as it tried to process the words. Then her lips curled into a smirk, sharp, disbelieving, almost amused, a flash of teeth that said, "You've got to be kidding me." "You own the Pinnacle Lux?" She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, her ponytail swinging like a taunt, her voice laced with mockery. "Okay, sure. I'm gonna have to call the manager." She reached for the phone, her nails glinting under the chandelier light, her smirk widening as if she'd just caught Denise in a lie she couldn't wait to expose. "Go ahead," Denise said, her tone so even it could have leveled a building. Her eyes locked on Tara's with a quiet intensity that made the air hum. The lobby shifted, a ripple spreading through the space like a stone dropped in still water. A couple in matching khaki vests, fresh off some overpriced vineyard tour, their tans still glowing, paused mid-sip, their iced lattes hovering like props in a bad sitcom, their whispers starting to buzz. A guy in a gray hoodie by the fireplace peeked over his phone, his thumb frozen mid-scroll, his earbuds dangling as he strained to hear. The doorman, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a scowl etched into his face like it was carved there, rocked on his heels, eyeing Denise like she might swipe the silver candlesticks and bolt for the exit. She could feel it, the familiar hum of doubt circling her, the unspoken chorus rising in their heads. Who does she think she is? It wasn't new. It was old, worn, a tune she'd heard since she was a kid, and it still stung. Not because it surprised her, but because it didn't. Tara wasn't just a receptionist. She was a gatekeeper, a foot soldier in a system that thrived on snap judgments and invisible rules, a cog in a machine that sorted people into yes and no with a glance. Her smirk wasn't personal. It was procedural, a reflex honed by a culture that taught her to measure worth by appearance, to guard the door against anyone who didn't fit the frame. But Tara wasn't the mastermind. That title belonged to someone higher up, someone who'd turned Denise's dream into a cold, efficient engine that spat her out at her own doorstep. That shadow was about to step into the light, and Denise could feel its weight pressing down. Moments later, a wiry man with a tie knotted too tight and a clipboard clutched like a lifeline shuffled out from a side door, his shoes squeaking faintly on the marble. His badge read, Assistant Manager, Greg Tatum. He adjusted his glasses, peering at Denise like she was a math problem he'd failed in high school, his thin lips twitching as he tried to muster a smile. "Good evening," he said, his cheer so forced it sounded like a car salesman on his last pitch, his voice cracking slightly under the strain. "Is there an issue with your reservation?" "She claims to own the hotel," Tara cut in, her voice loud enough to bounce off the chandelier and land in the khaki couple's laps, her smirk still lingering as she leaned back, arms crossed, daring Greg to take her side. Greg hesitated, his eyes darting between Denise and Tara like a ping-pong ball caught in a gust. Right. Your name?" His pen hovered over the clipboard, trembling slightly, as if he wasn't sure whether to write or run. "Denise Harrow," she said, each syllable a hammer strike, deliberate and unyielding. "You'll find it on every quarterly report, every board memo, every lease agreement since this place opened 6 years ago. I'm here for one night. There's a suite held under the owner's block. Standard protocol, check your manual." Greg's mouth twitched again, a nervous tick he couldn't suppress, his glasses slipping down his nose as sweat beaded on his forehead. "Okay, just give me a second." He turned away, muttering into his walkie-talkie, his voice a low buzz of panic that crackled through the static. That's when security rolled in, not loud, not grabbing, but present, their boots heavy on the marble. One guard, bald and built like a linebacker, stationed himself by the elevators, arms crossed, his head gleaming under the chandelier like a polished dome. Another, leaner with a buzz cut and a jaw tight enough to crack walnuts, leaned against the coffee bar, sipping a water bottle like he was auditioning for a buddy cop flick, his eyes never leaving Denise. Their presence wasn't a threat, it was a statement, a silent, "We're watching you, lady," and it hung in the air like smoke. Denise didn't budge. She didn't raise her voice or whip out her phone to livestream the absurdity, though the thought flickered briefly. She could have had 1,000,000 views by midnight, hashtags trending, Tara's smirk plastered across X. She stood there, satchel still slung over her shoulder, her gaze steady as a sniper's scope, her hands calm at her sides. Inside, though, a fire flickered. Not full-on rage, not yet, but a slow, smoldering exhaustion that had been simmering for decades. She'd been here before, not just in Omaha, but in lobbies from Charlotte to Sacramento, boardrooms from Dallas to Detroit, bank offices from Minneapolis to Miami, places where her brown skin, her natural hair twisted into a low bun, her quiet confidence didn't match the blueprint people carried for power, a blueprint that was white, male, loud, and dripping with privilege she'd never been handed. She could have flashed her driver's license, waved ownership papers, or called her attorney to rain legal hell on their heads. Instead, she stepped back, pulled out her phone, and made one call. 28 seconds. That's all it took. Denise didn't pace as she waited by the marble pillar, her sneakers rooted to the floor, her satchel a steady weight against her hip. She didn't need to move. Her mind was already racing, pulling her back, not to last week or last year, but to 1999, when she was 23, shivering in a St. Paul motel lobby that smelled like mildew, cigarette ash, and despair. Rain hammered the roof that night, a relentless drumbeat that leaked through a crack in the ceiling, dripping into a rusted bucket by the desk with a hollow plink, plink, plink. She'd dropped out of college 6 months earlier, not because she couldn't hack it, but because her mom's cancer had metastasized, and the hospital bills didn't give a damn about her 3.8 GPA in sociology or her half-finished thesis on systemic inequality. The motel gig was supposed to be a stopgap, a lifeline to keep the lights on at home while her mom slept under a quilt Denise had patched with duct tape, the fabric fraying at the edges like their lives. Her first night on the job, a trucker with a beard like steel wool and breath like a distillery stumbled in at 2 a.m., his flannel shirt soaked through, his boots tracking mud across the linoleum she'd just mopped. "You got anything, sweetheart?" he slurred, leaning over the counter, his weight creaking the wood, his eyes glassy as he fumbled with a wad of crumpled bills. Denise forced a smile, her hands trembling as she flipped through the ledger. Paper, not digital, because Marty, the owner, was too cheap for a computer and too lazy to care. "One left, sir. $30, she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. He tossed a 20 and a handful of quarters that scattered across the counter, then grabbed the key and staggered off, muttering about, "Damn city girls who think they're too good." Marty waddled out from his office, a beer can sweating in his meaty hand, his gut straining against a stained t-shirt. He smirked, his yellowed teeth glinting under the fluorescent light. "Good job, sweetie. Don't get any big ideas, though. You're just the help." She nodded, swallowing the sting, her throat tight as she watched him shuffle back to his TV, the laugh track from some late-night sitcom blaring through the thin walls. She waited until he was gone, then pulled a soaked napkin from her pocket, the edges curling from the rain. On it, in smudged ink from a pen she'd borrowed from the desk, she scribbled her first dream. "A place where people like me aren't just the help. A place where I decide who belongs." 2 years later, at 25, she'd clawed her way up to a mid-tier hotel in Minneapolis, working nights behind a desk that wobbled every time she typed, the legs uneven from years of neglect. The manager, Paul, a wiry guy with a comb-over and a chip on his shoulder the size of Lake Superior, didn't like her uppity voice, too polished, too sharp, too educated for someone he assumed hadn't finished high school, let alone college. "You sound like you're auditioning for NPR," he'd snapped one night, his breath sour with cheap coffee as he loomed over her, his tie dangling like a noose. "Guests don't need a lecture, they need a key." He shoved her to night audit a week later, thinking the graveyard shift would break her, that the silence and the numbers would grind her down. He was wrong. She thrived. Alone with the ledgers, she cracked the code. Revenue spiked on weekends when business travelers rolled in, dipped midweek when the rooms sat empty. Guests checked out early because the coffee tasted like dishwater, and the day staff snapped at them like they were intruders. She started tweaking things, ordering better coffee beans from a local roaster she'd sweet-talked into a discount, slipping extra pillows to regulars who tipped her in smiles, balancing the book so tight Paul couldn't find a dime out of place. She wrote her first business plan on a legal pad at 3 a.m., the snow outside piling up to her knees, her breath fogging in the unheated back office, Prince's Purple Rain crackling faintly from the lobby radio like a lifeline to her roots. Paul found it one morning, laughed until his face turned red, and tossed it in the trash. "Stick to counting, honey. This ain't your game." She fished it out when he left, her hands cold but her resolve molten, the paper creased but unbroken. By 29, she'd saved $12,000. Every penny from tips, overtime, and a side gig cleaning offices after hours. Her knees bruised from scrubbing floors, her back aching from hauling trash. She walked into a Denver bank with a binder full of numbers and a suit from Goodwill, the seams straining at her shoulders, the hem frayed from too many washes. The loan officer, Tom Baxter, a balding man with a paunch and a smirk that could curdle milk, barely glanced at her pitch, 50 pages of projections, occupancy rates, cost breakdowns she'd calculated by hand. "A black girl running hotels?" he chuckled, leaning back in his chair, his tie loose around his thick neck. "Come on, honey. This ain't the Holiday Inn. Stick to something smaller. Maybe a nail salon." His laugh echoed in the sterile room, the other bankers glancing over with smirks of their own. She smiled, her teeth gritted behind her lips, and signed his predatory loan, 18% interest, balloon payments, terms designed to watch her drown. She paid it off in 3 years, sending the final check with a note. "See you at the top, Tom." His jaw dropped when she opened the Pinnacle on Colfax in 2006. 80 rooms, no frills, but hers. She painted the walls herself, the beige dripping onto her jeans as she balanced on a rickety ladder, haggled with suppliers until her throat hurt, trained the staff to greet every guest like family. Eye contact, a smile, a welcome back for the regulars. It wasn't fancy, but it was full. Travelers who'd never felt seen kept coming back, their tips piling up in a jar she used to buy better linens. That was the seed. By 2010, she had 3 properties. By 2015, 10. Now at 19, she was a name, a force, except to people like Tara, who saw her and saw nothing. Back in Omaha, the memory grounded her like an anchor in a storm. She stood by the pillar, phone back in her pocket, waiting for the call to ripple through the ranks. Tara kept typing, her nails a frantic drum roll, as if the screen might rewrite reality if she hit the keys hard enough. Greg returned, clutching a folder like a shield, his tie looser now, his forehead slick with sweat that glistened under the chandelier light. "Ms. Harrow," he said, overpronouncing her name like it was a foreign language he'd just learned, his voice trembling slightly. "I think there's been a mix-up. We just need to verify." "You can verify all you want," Denise interrupted, her voice soft but unyielding, a quiet thunder that rolled through the lobby. "I'm not moving." Greg froze, his glasses slipping further down his nose, his clipboard trembling in his hands. He glanced at the security guard by the elevators, who shrugged like he wasn't paid enough to pick a side. The lobby was a pressure cooker now. Guests whispering, staff shifting, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Near the window, 3 women in yoga pants murmured behind their manicured hands, their iced teas sweating on the table. A guy with a man bun and a sketchbook pretended to draw, his eyes flicking up every few seconds, his pencil hovering. Tara, meanwhile, had her phone out under the desk, scrolling with the desperation of someone who just bet on the wrong horse, probably Googling Denise Harrow and praying for a blank page, her nails tapping nervously against the glass screen. It was almost comical. Almost. Denise had seen this movie before. The disbelief, the double take, the slow realization that, oh crap, she might not be bluffing. It wasn't just about a room. It was about the mental gymnastics people did when they saw her. Brown skin, no designer purse, no loud jewelry, no entourage barking orders. She didn't fit the picture they'd painted of owner, a picture that was usually white, male, and dripping with privilege she'd never been handed on a silver platter. She remembered a bank in Cleveland 15 years back, when a loan officer had chuckled through her pitch, saying, "A hotel chain? You? Stick to something smaller, honey." She'd taken his predatory loan, paid it off early, and turned that first property into an empire. Now, at 48, she was a CEO with a Forbes cover, a TED Talk under her belt, and a net worth that could buy this building twice over and still have cash left for a private jet. And still, here she was, proving it all over again, her sneakers silent, but her presence loud enough to shake the walls. The elevator dinged, and 3 figures stormed out, their steps a chaotic symphony on the marble. First came Victor Langston, regional VP, in a crisp gray suit that screamed, former lacrosse star turned corporate shark, his jaw tight, his blonde hair gelled into submission. Next was Javier Ortiz, district manager, in a black fleece with the Harrow Enterprises logo, shorter and stockier, his dark circles under his eyes like badges of too many sleepless nights spent crunching numbers. Trailing behind, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to judgment, was Marla Jackson. 50, wiry, with gray streaks threading through her tight braids, her brown eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Marla had been Denise's right hand in the early days. A saint. Paul native who'd worked the desk with her at that Minneapolis hotel, the two of them bonding over burnt coffee, Paul's snide remarks, and a shared dream of something better. They'd sketched the pinnacle idea on napkins during midnight breaks, laughing about the day they'd run their own show. Marla had left Harrow Enterprises in 2020, fed up with Philip Grayson's efficiency obsession that stripped the soul from their vision, and hadn't spoken to Denise since, a rift that still ached like a bruise Denise couldn't press. Now, here she was, in Omaha, her presence a jolt that hit Denise like a live wire. "Denise," Marla said, her voice low and rough, cutting through Victor's flustered apologies like a blade through butter. "Heard you were in town. Didn't think I'd find you fighting your own damn door again." Denise's jaw tightened, a flicker of old hurt surfacing beneath her calm. "Marla, what are you doing here?" Her words were clipped, her eyes searching Marla's face for answers. Anger, regret, something to explain the years of silence. "Consulting gig," Marla said, nodding toward the lobby, her braids swaying slightly. "Freelance now, training staff for a competitor. Saw the circus out here and figured you'd need backup. Same old story, huh? You walk in, they see a stranger. Never changes." Victor cleared his throat, desperate to regain control, his tie askew from nervous tugging. "Ms. Harrow, we're so sorry. I just got the call." "Save it," Denise said, her eyes still locked on Marla, her voice sharp enough to slice through his platitudes. "Fix it." As Victor and Javier scrambled, Marla stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of their shared past. "Philip's been rotting this place for years, Dee. I warned you when I walked out. He's not just lazy, he's dangerous. You didn't listen. Kept him close, let him fester. Look where it got you." "I listened," Denise said, her tone hardening, her fingers tightening on her satchel strap. "I just didn't think he'd turn on me. I trusted him. Trusted you too, until you bailed." Marla smirked, bittersweet, her eyes glinting with something between pain and defiance. "I didn't bail. I saved myself. You built a castle, Dee, but you forgot to check the foundations. Philip's the termite. You're the one who let him in." The words landed like a punch, but before Denise could fire back, another voice broke through. "Miss Denise!" It was Cal Reed, a barrel-chested trucker in a faded flannel jacket, his gray beard flecked with coffee stains, his boots scuffing the marble as he ambled over. Cal had been a regular at the Pinnacle on Colfax back in '06, one of Denise's first loyal guests, a long-haul driver who'd roll in at dawn with stories of the road and a grin that warmed the lobby. He'd recognized her the moment she walked in, her quiet stride unchanged from the days she'd slipped him an extra blanket on cold nights or poured him coffee when the pot was supposed to be off limits. "Still making waves, I see," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl that carried over the lobby hum. "Cal," Denise said, a faint smile breaking through her tension, a flicker of light in the storm. "Still hauling?" "Till the wheels fall off," he chuckled, his laugh deep and rumbling, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "This place ain't the same without you behind the desk, though. Used to feel like home, coffee hot, folks smiling. Now it's all stiff, cold, like a damn bank." The words stung, a quiet echo of Marla's warning, a knife twisting in the wound. Before Denise could respond, a third voice cut in, sharp, insistent, slicing through the air like a siren. "Denise Harrow?" It was Sonia Patel, a petite woman in a leather jacket, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her brown eyes sharp with purpose as she clutched a notebook and a recorder. She stepped forward, her sneakers silent but her presence loud, a journalist's hunger radiating from her. "Sonia Patel, freelance investigator. I've been tracking Roland Tate for months. Word is he's got claws deep in your company. Care to comment? Denise's smile vanished, her spine stiffening as she turned to face Sonia. Not now, she said, her voice a low warning, her eyes narrowing. Sonia didn't budge, her notebook flipping open, her pen poised. You'll want to hear this. It's bigger than Omaha, bigger than a bad night at the desk. Tate's not just sniffing around, he's got a plan, and your COO's his ticket in. I've got proof, dates, meetings, a paper trail. Give me 5 minutes. Denise hesitated, her mind racing. Marla's warning, Cal's nostalgia, Sonia's bombshell piling onto the weight of Tara's smirk. 5 minutes, she said finally, her voice tight. Upstairs, not here. Victor and Javier hustled, clearing Suite 1400, their voices a frantic buzz as they barked orders into their phones. Denise took the key cards and rode the elevator up, Marla and Sonia trailing her, Cal waving a good luck as the doors closed. In the suite, the citrus scent hit her first. Orange peel and eucalyptus, a faint tang that clashed with the rising unease coiling in her chest. The fruit tray sat on the table, grapes, pineapple, a sliced mango she hadn't asked for, but appreciated appreciation. A small nod to the staff's scrambling attempt to make amends. Espresso pods were stacked beside a gleaming machine, and a rushed handwritten note read, DH, deepest apologies from the team. She paced the room, not out of restlessness but purpose, running her fingers along the edge of the dresser, checking the corners, not just for dust, but for intent, for proof that someone still cared about the experience she'd built with her bare hands. She pulled out her phone, texting Lena. Dig into Philip's meetings with Roland Tate. Every date, every dime. Now. Her mind flashed to 2021, a Scottsdale golf course, Philip's tan glowing as he clapped her on the back, his white teeth flashing in the sun. We're streamlining, Denise, cutting fat, boosting profit. Trust me. She'd nodded, distracted by a new property opening in Phoenix, missing the glint in his eye, the way his hand lingered too long. Now, she saw it. A meeting with Roland Tate, caught on a grainy security cam Sonia had slipped her later. A still from a private club. Philip shaking hands with Roland, a hawk-faced developer in a tailored suit, his gray hair slicked back, his smile sharp as a blade. Roland had offered Philip a deal. Sink her, and you get 20% of the new empire. She's a dreamer. Let her dream. We'll build the reality. Philip had hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing, then shaken hands, his smile tight with greed, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. Downstairs, Philip's rot was everywhere. Tara's training, 3 hours of online modules instead of the 2-week program Denise had designed, was his doing. He'd slashed budgets, hired cheap, let the culture fester into a cold transactional shell. Worse, Sonia's intel painted a darker picture. Philip had planted loyalists across the chain, staffers like Greg, pliable and spineless, who'd sabotage from within without even knowing it. Roland wanted Harrow Enterprises broken, its value tanked, ripe for a hostile takeover. Omaha wasn't a fluke. It was a test, a dry run to see how far they could push before Denise pushed back. And they'd miscalculated. Sonia sat on the suite's sofa, flipping through her notebook, her voice clipped. Tate's been meeting Philip every quarter since 2022. Scottsdale, Vegas, Phoenix. Always off books, always cash heavy. I've got receipts, photos, a burner phone log. He's not just buying influence. He's buying your company out from under you. Marla leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her braids swaying as she shook her head. Told you, D. Philip's a snake. Always was. You gave him the keys and he's selling the locks. Denise stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. How deep does it go? Deep, Sonia said, tapping her pen. He's got 5 execs in his pocket. Regional managers, finance guys. They've been cooking books, skimming profits, tanking service scores to drive stock down. Tate's got a shell company ready to swoop in when the price drops. Your empire's a house of cards, and he's pulling the table. Denise's jaw tightened, her pulse kicking up. Proof? Enough to bury him, Sonia said. But it's messy. You go public, it's war, legal, PR, all of it. You stay quiet, they win slow. Marla snorted. They're already winning. Look at this place. Your name's on the door and they're locking you out. Denise turned to the window, Omaha's lights flickering below, her reflection a ghost in the glass. They think I'm soft. They're wrong. Alone for a moment as Sonia stepped out to take a call and Marla rummaged for coffee, Denise stood by the window, the city's hum a distant pulse. Her reflection stared back, brown skin, tired eyes, a woman who'd fought to be seen and still faded into the frame. They don't see me, she thought, the words a quiet ache that had rooted deep, a weed she couldn't pull. They never see me. My skin's a question they don't want to answer, and I've spent my life proving what they won't believe. She pressed a hand to the glass, cold against her palm, her breath fogging the surface. But it's not them I need to convince. It's me. Every time I walk in, I brace for it. The look, the pause, the doubt. I built this to stop asking myself if I belong, so why am I still asking? She remembered Cal's words. Used to feel like home. And Marla's jab. Forgot to check the foundations. They cut deeper than Tara's smirk, because they were true. She'd built this to escape invisibility, to carve a space where she didn't have to explain her existence, yet here she was, a ghost in her own story. At 33, pitching in Dallas, an investor had leaned back, his cowboy boots propped on the table, and asked, "You're the diversity hire, right? Cute story, but who's really running this?" She'd smiled, closed the deal, then cried in her car, the weight of not enough crushing her chest, her hands shaking as she gripped the wheel. At 38, in Phoenix, a hotel manager had followed her to the elevator, his radio crackling as he muttered about theft issues, his eyes on her satchel like it held stolen goods. She'd turned, stared him down until he backed off, but the sting lingered, a bruise that never faded. Now, at 48, she wondered, how many times do I have to prove I belong before I stop proving it to myself? She closed her eyes, the memory of her mom's voice surfacing. Weak from chemo, but firm. "You're enough, Dee. They don't see it. That's their loss. Don't you lose it too." She'd been 22 then, sitting by the hospital bed, the quilt patched and fraying, her mom's hand cold in hers. She'd nodded, but the doubt had stuck, a shadow she couldn't shake. Opening her eyes, she stared at the city below. I'm enough. I've always been enough. They don't get to decide that anymore. Downstairs, Victor and Javier bickered in the office, a brief respite from the tension that had the lobby buzzing. "You let me look like an idiot out there," Victor snapped, his coffee sloshing as he gestured wildly, his tie flapping like a flag in a storm. Javier rolled his eyes, his fingers flying over his laptop. "Oh, sorry. I was busy saving our asses from her wrath. Maybe if you'd read the damn manual instead of golfing with Philip." Elena stormed in, slamming a folder down, her glasses fogging from the heat of her glare. "Shut it, both of you. We've got a mess to clean, and I'm not babysitting your egos." Victor sputtered. Javier smirked, and the room dissolved into a grudging silence, the air thick with unspoken curses. In the lobby, Tara faced her own test, her hands shaky as she tried to channel Denise's advice. A grizzled guest in a trucker hat, his plaid shirt stained with grease, leaned over the desk, his voice a growl. "Gimme a room with a river view, girlie. None of this city crap." Tara blinked, her nails tapping nervously. "Sir, I respect you really, but there's no river here. Omaha's, landlocked." The man stared, then roared with laughter, his belly shaking. "Well, damn. You're all right, kid. Gimme whatever's clean. I ain't picky." Tara exhaled, a shaky grin breaking through, her shoulders dropping as he shuffled off. She glanced at the plaque, Harrow Enterprises, and muttered, "Okay, maybe I can do this." Upstairs, Marla brewed coffee in the suite's kitchenette, grumbling as the machine sputtered. "Fancy hotel and the damn thing's older than me," she said, banging it with her fist. Sonia, back from her call, smirked. "Need a hand, or you gonna fight it to death?" Marla shot her a look. "Keep it up, kid, and you're next." Denise watched, a faint smile tugging at her lips, the first real one all night, grateful for the absurdity amid the chaos. At 6:45 a.m., Denise descended the elevator, transformed. Gone were the sneakers and blazer. Now she wore a slate gray suit, tailored to perfection, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to reckoning. Her hair was swept into a sleek updo, her expression a mask of quiet authority that could have silenced a courtroom mid-trial. The lobby froze. Guests mid-checkout, staff mid-sentence, the barista mid-pour, her espresso wand dripping onto the counter like a leaky faucet. Victor and Javier waited by the fireplace, clutching folders and untouched coffees, their ties askew, their eyes bloodshot, looking like they'd aged a decade overnight under the weight of her gaze. She didn't pause. She strode to the executive conference room, a glass-walled box near the concierge desk, her heels echoing like gunshots on the marble, each step a declaration. Inside sat Greg, Tara, and Elena Voss, a stern brunette from HR with a notepad and a stare that could peel paint off a wall. They stiffened as Denise entered, standing at the head of the table, arms crossed, her presence filling the room like a storm cloud rolling in over the plains. "Someone explained last night," she said, her voice a low rumble that vibrated the glass walls, her eyes sweeping over them like a searchlight. Tara stared at her lap, her hands twisting in her lap like she was trying to wring out her nerves, her nails chipped from nervous picking. Greg coughed, fumbling for words that refused to form, his glasses fogging as he sweated through his shirt. Finally, Tara mumbled, I didn't expect someone like me to own this place," Denise finished, her tone even but sharp enough to draw blood, her gaze pinning Tara like a butterfly to a board. Tara nodded, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes darting to the floor. "Yeah. Was I rude?" Denise asked, her words deliberate, each one a stone dropped into the silence. "No, ma'am," Tara said, her voice trembling, her hands stilling for a moment. "Did I yell? Threaten anyone?" "No," Tara whispered, her face pale, her ponytail sagging like her spirit. Denise turned to Elena, her gaze unwavering, her posture a steel rod. "I don't want a witch hunt, but I need accountability. This can't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." Elena nodded, her pen poised over her notepad, her lips tight. "Understood. We'll document it, retrain, review." Javier jumped in, his voice tight, his tablet glowing in his hands. "We're issuing a write-up for Tara. No front desk until recertification's complete. Greg's on administrative review pending interviews with staff. We've got a plan. Mandatory training, site-wide, no exceptions." Denise sat finally, her gaze locking on Tara like a laser, her hands folded on the table. "How long have you worked here?" 5 months, Tara said, her voice shaky, her eyes flicking up briefly before dropping again. "Ever think about who built this hotel? Where it came from?" Denise asked, her tone softening slightly, but still firm, a teacher pressing a student who'd forgotten the lesson. Tara shrugged, her shoulders hunching, her voice small. "I figured it was like a big company, investors or whatever. Didn't really think about it." 19 properties, Denise said, leaning forward, her words slow and deliberate, each one a brick in the wall she was rebuilding. "From Portland to Miami. I designed them to be human, luxury for everyone, service with soul. I built this because I was sick of being invisible, of walking into places and being sized up like I didn't belong. So why am I still a ghost in my own lobby? Why am I still proving myself to you?" Tara shrank into her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. Greg's cheeks turned tomato red, his glasses fogging further, his clipboard slipping in his sweaty grip. Javier spoke up, his voice steady despite the tension. "Memos going out today. Mandatory inclusivity training, all staff, no exceptions. We're resetting the culture top to bottom." "Make it real," Denise said, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. "Not checklists or buzzwords. I want them to feel it. Every guest, every story, every mistake like this. No more ghosts." Victor nodded, his jaw tight, his coffee cold in his hand. "We'll make it stick. Real stories, real training. It's on us." She stood, ending the meeting with a single nod, her heels clicking as she turned to the door. But she wasn't finished. One more conversation waited, one that would slice deeper than policy or procedure, one that would plant a seed she'd tend herself. By 9 a.m., the lobby buzzed with normalcy. Guests dragging roller bags across the tile, the coffee bar humming with the clink of cups and the hiss of steam, the world moving on like it always did. But Denise wasn't ready to leave. She waited until the morning rush thinned, then slipped into the staff lounge, a narrow room tucked behind the coffee bar, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Tara sat alone at a rickety table, a stale croissant crumbling in her hands, her phone dark on the tabletop, her ponytail loose and fraying. She jolted upright as Denise approached, nearly knocking over her water glass, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the edge, her eyes wide with panic. "Relax," Denise said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her, her voice gentle but firm, her satchel resting beside her. "Just here to talk." Tara nodded, her eyes darting to the floor, her hands twisting again. "Yes, okay. Ever feel small at a job?" Denise asked, her tone probing, her eyes steady as she leaned back slightly. Tara blinked, caught off guard, her brows knitting together. "Yeah, all the time." "Tell me," Denise said, her voice softening, an invitation rather than a command. "I worked at this dive bar off I-80, Tara said, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining traction, her hands stilling as she spoke. Sticky floors, rude drunks yelling for beers. They'd snap at me like I was a dog. "Hey, Blondie, move faster." The cook screamed if I messed up an order, even when it wasn't my fault. I'd go home feeling like nothing, like I didn't even exist, just a shadow they yelled at. Most days I'd sit in my car after just staring at the wheel, wondering why I bothered. "So you know invisibility," Denise said, her voice steady, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned forward. "You know what it's like to be erased. So why'd you make me feel it last night? Why'd you look at me and decide I didn't belong?" Tara's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the croissant until it crumbled into a pile of flakes, her eyes darting up to meet Denise's for the first time, wide and wet. "I didn't mean, you didn't look like..." "Like what?" Denise pressed, her voice firm but not harsh, her gaze unrelenting. "Like I own hotels? Like I belong here?" Tara didn't answer, her silence a confession, her shoulders slumping as the weight settled. She stared at the crumbs, her lips trembling, her nails digging into her palms. "That's the trap," Denise said, her words slow and heavy, each one a stone laid carefully. "You've got this image in your head, white, male, loud, rich, swaggering in with a Rolex and a loud voice. I don't fit, so you assumed. That assumption isn't just yours. It's baked into this place, into the way you were trained, into the system Philip built while I wasn't looking. It's why I'm here, fighting my own door." "I'm sorry," Tara said, her voice cracking like thin ice, her eyes glistening as she blinked rapidly. "I mean it. I didn't think." "It's a start," Denise replied, her gaze softening but not relenting, her hands folding on the table. "But I'm not here for sorry. I'm here so you see me. Not as your boss, not as a cautionary tale, as a person. I started as a desk clerk, just like you. Got called girl by guests, help by managers, followed by security because I didn't look right. I fought for every inch of this, every brick, every dream. I built this chain so people like you could rise, not so you could push me back down. So why'd you push?" Tara's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise breaking through her guilt, her voice barely audible. "You were really a clerk?" "Yep," Denise said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, a spark of memory lighting her eyes. "Night shift, Minneapolis. Boss said I sounded too smart for phones, stuck me in the back doing audits. I'd sit there 3 a.m., snow piling up outside, balancing books while the radio played Prince. That's where it began. Me, a calculator, and a dream no one else could see. I fought to make it real, and I'm still fighting. You don't have to fight me, too." "That's wild," Tara said, a tiny laugh escaping her, more from shock than humor, her shoulders easing slightly. "It shouldn't be," Denise said, her smile fading, her voice firm again. "It should be normal. People like me, like you, building something bigger. Be aware, Tara. Every guest, old, young, broke, fancy, deserves dignity. Start there, and you won't have to claw your way back from nights like last night. You can rise without stepping on me." She stood, leaving Tara staring at the crumbs on the table, her water glass still trembling slightly, her eyes wide with something new. Guilt, yes, but also a spark of understanding. As Denise walked out, something lifted, not the weight of the fight, but the fog of being unseen. She'd planted a seed, and whether it grew was up to Tara now. But the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Back in the management office, Victor stood by the window, watching the valet line like a hawk tracking prey, his coffee cold in his hand. Javier typed furiously at his laptop, his fingers a blur, his coffee untouched beside him. Elena reviewed files, her pen scratching across her notepad with military precision, her glasses perched on her nose. Denise sat at the desk, flipping through staff evaluations, her pen tapping once against the wood. A single, deliberate beat that cut through the hum. "I'm not here to punish," she said aloud, her voice slicing the air, her eyes scanning the room. "I'm here to stop this from happening again. To me, to anyone. This isn't a one-off. It's a symptom. Fix the disease." Javier looked up, his fingers pausing, his voice steady. "We're revamping hiring. Empathy tests, bias checks, pattern evaluations. No more Taras slipping through untrained. No more Gregs coasting on autopilot." "Good," she said, her pen tapping again, a metronome of intent. "And put me on rotation. Next quarter, I'll hit random properties. No heads up, no fanfare. Just me, walking in, seeing what they see." Victor's brows shot up, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, his voice a mix of shock and awe. "Like a secret shopper? Undercover boss?" "Not secret," she said, her eyes locking on his, her voice a quiet thunder. "Anonymous until I'm not. They'll know me when I'm ready. Not before." Javier grinned, a rare flash of teeth breaking his fatigue. "That'll freak people out. Managers sweating, staff scrambling." "Let it," she said, her voice a low growl, her gaze unwavering. "Real work doesn't come with a warning. They'll learn to see, or they'll learn to leave." She handed them a folder, the edges crisp, the weight of it heavy with purpose. "Training's live by next Friday. Add stories. Real guest experiences. Raw words. No polish. I want staff reading what it feels like to be turned away, ignored, dismissed. No corporate fluff, no scripted apologies, just truth." "Done," Victor said, taking the folder like it was a live grenade, his fingers tightening around it. She left the office, pausing at the front desk. A new clerk, a guy with a buzz cut and a genuine smile, nodded respectfully, his "Good morning, ma'am," carrying none of Tara's edge, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. She nodded back, scanning the lobby, guests milling, coffee pouring, the world turning. It looked the same, but she felt it. Tiny fractures in the old ways, the first tremors of change rippling through the cracks. Upstairs, she grabbed her bag, the leather satchel zipped tight, her laptop resting on the desk with its charger coiled neatly beside it. A note sat on the nightstand, simple, on torn paper, the handwriting shaky but earnest. "Ms. Harrow, thank you for not giving up on me. I'll do better. Tara." She folded it once and slipped it into her purse, a quiet proof that something had landed where it needed to, a small weight against the storm brewing ahead. The car to the airport was silent, just the hum of tires on pavement and the driver's steady breathing, the city blurring past her window, rows of brick buildings, corner gas stations, faded signs for diners and tire shops. Denise held Tara's note, staring out at Omaha's gray skyline, the freight trains groaning in the distance, the faint tang of BBQ smoke drifting from old market stalls. She hadn't planned this detour, not the hotel, not the fight, but maybe it was fate, not for the board meeting she'd crashed, but for the mirror she'd held up to everyone in that lobby, that office, that suite. A mirror that showed them who they were when they thought no one was watching, a reflection they couldn't unsee. She wasn't shocked anymore, not by Tara's smirk, not by Greg's hesitation, not by the security guard's silent stares. She was tired, tired of proving her worth, tired of the mental checklists people ran when they saw her. Not loud enough, not rich-looking enough, not white enough. But she wasn't bitter. She turned memory into muscle, and that's what carried her through every lobby, every boardroom, every bank office that tried to shrink her down. As the terminal loomed, she thought of her younger self, 25, in a thrift store blazer 2 sizes too big, working nights at that Minneapolis hotel, her flat soaked from the snow, her hands cold as she balanced the books Paul couldn't be bothered to check. She'd built this empire to rewrite that story, to carve out a space where she didn't have to explain her existence. Yet even now, with 19 properties and a team of executives reporting to her, people saw her and saw less, until they couldn't. At security, her phone buzzed. A text from Lena. "Philip Grayson's on the line. Says it's urgent. Freaking out. Philip." The COO who'd let this culture fester, who'd turned her vision into a conveyor belt of Tara's and Greg's, who'd smiled to her face while sharpening a knife for her back. She smirked, her thumb hovering over the screen, her pulse steady. He'd heard about Omaha, probably sweating through his Armani shirt, pacing his corner office, ready to spin excuses about miscommunication and oversights. She typed back, "Tell him I'll call from the plane. He waits. Pull every training log since 2020, every expense report. Hard copies by tomorrow." She boarded, settling into her seat as the engines roared to life, the cabin humming with the low buzz of passengers stowing bags and flipping through magazines. Then the twist hit. Her phone lit up with an email from an unknown sender, the subject line a jolt. "You're not the only one watching." Inside, a grainy photo. Philip, grinning at a private club, shaking hands with Roland Tate, a rival developer who'd been circling her properties like a vulture for years. His gray suit crisp, his eyes cold. A single line followed. "Check your training logs. He's been skimming, but he's not alone." Below it, a list, 5 names, all execs under Philip, regional managers, finance leads, loyalists she'd trusted. A conspiracy, not a solo act. Her empire wasn't just leaking, it was infested. Denise's jaw tightened, her pulse kicking up a notch, her fingers tightening around Tara's note until the paper crinkled. Philip wasn't just negligent, he was a traitor, sabotaging her from the inside, feeding Tate intel to tank her empire while pocketing the profits. She scrolled back through her mental files. Philip's push for streamlined training, his insistence on cutting empathy modules to save time, his oddly timed golf trips with investors he never named, his smug assurances that everything's under control. It clicked into place like a lock snapping shut, the pieces aligning with a sickening clarity. Last night wasn't random. It was a symptom of his rot, a crack he'd let widen while he played both sides, a test to see how far he could push before she pushed back. She forwarded the email to Lena with 2 words, "Dig deeper." Then she leaned back, the note from Tara still in her hand, the plane climbing higher as Omaha shrank below. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She'd walk into that board meeting in Chicago with more than numbers. She'd bring fire, evidence, and a reckoning that would burn through Philip's lies like dry grass. But the bigger twist loomed. Those 5 names, a web she hadn't seen, a betrayal deeper than she'd imagined. And one name stood out, Harold Grayson, a board member, Philip's uncle, a silver-haired patriarch who'd invested in her first hotel back in '06, his handshake firm, his smile warm. She'd thought he was family, mentor, ally, rock. Now she saw the truth. He was the puppet master, pulling Philip's strings, using Roland as the muscle to seize control of the empire he'd helped her build, resenting her rise every step of the way. In Chicago, she stormed the boardroom at 2 p.m. The Harrow Enterprises HQ, a sleek tower on Michigan Avenue she'd bought in 2018, back when Philip had clapped her on the shoulder and called her the real deal. The irony tasted bitter now, a sour tang on her tongue. She strode in, her satchel thudding onto the table, the sound cutting through the murmur of 12 board members like a gunshot. Philip stood at the head, his tan glowing under the fluorescence, his suit pristine, his smile too wide, too rehearsed, his hands clasped like a preacher about to deliver a sermon. "Denise," he said, spreading his arms like a game show host, his voice smooth as oil. "Heard you had a rough night in Omaha. Everything okay? I've been worried." "Define okay, Philip," she cut in, her voice a whip crack, her eyes blazing as she pulled out a stack of papers, printouts Lena had overnighted, logs, receipts, photos, slamming them onto the table with a force that rattled the water glasses. "Because last night, I walked into my own hotel and got treated like a stray. Care to explain why? Or should I start with these? Training logs you gutted, expense reports you padded, meetings with Roland Tate you forgot to mention?" His smile faltered, just for a second, his eyes darting to the papers, his tan paling slightly. "Denise, you're overreacting. A mix-up, I'm sure. Staff turnover's been high." "Stop," she said, her voice a blade, stepping closer, her heels clicking like a countdown. "Don't lie to me. Not here. Not now. You turned my vision into a factory, a shell. And while you were streamlining, you were whining and dining Roland Tate. 3 meetings, Philip. Scottsdale, Vegas, Phoenix. Want to tell me what my COO's doing with a man who's tried to buy me out twice? Or should I ask Harold? The room went silent, the board members shifting in their seats, their ties loosening, their eyes darting between her and Philip. Harold, at the far end, stiffened, his silver hair catching the light, his hands folding on the table, his face a mask of calm that didn't reach his eyes. Philip's mouth opened, then closed, his hands clenching at his sides, his voice rising. "That's a misunderstanding." "No," she said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a lethal calm that could have frozen fire. "It's a betrayal. You've been skimming. Time, money, trust. You let my hotels rot while you played golf with the enemy. And Harold's been holding your leash, hasn't he? Why? Why turn on me after all this?" Philip straightened, his charm cracking, his voice cold now, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the only one with ambition, Denise. I've carried this company. Years of cleaning up your messes, your vision." Harold saw it too. "She's a dreamer," he said, "but dreams don't pay. I made this real." "Carried?" She laughed, sharp and bitter, her eyes flashing as she cut him off. "I built this with my hands while you were still kissing frat boy rings at Yale. You don't carry me. You ride me. And now you're selling me out to your uncle and Tate because what? Ego? Greed? You think I'm too soft to fight back?" A board member, Margaret, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension. "Denise, if this is true—" "It is," she said, sliding the photo across the table. Philip and Roland, mid-handshake, the club's dim light casting shadows on their grins. "Check the logs. Check his expenses. $50K in consulting fees to a shell company tied to Tate. Check Harold's calls. 3 to Philip last week, 2 to Tate. Then check your spines because I'm done with half measures." Philip lunged for the photo, his hand shaking. But Harold snatched it first, his eyes narrowing, his voice low and gravelly. "Denise, you're out of line. I've backed you since day one." "Backed me?" she snapped, turning on him, her voice rising for the first time, raw and unfiltered. "You gave me seed money in '06, $200K, a handshake, a smile. I thought you believed in me. But you've been waiting, haven't you? Waiting for me to outgrow you, to eclipse you, so you could take it back. You used Philip as your pawn, Tate as your hammer. You don't back me. You bury me." Harold's mask slipped, his eyes flashing, his hands clenching into fists. "You owe me, Denise. I gave you that first shot. Without me, you're still in St. Paul, counting pennies. This is mine as much as yours." The room erupted, board members murmuring, Margaret grabbing the logs, another pulling out a phone. Denise stepped back, her satchel in hand, her voice steady again, a quiet fire. "I don't owe you my soul, Harold. I paid you back, tenfold, with interest. This is mine. You don't get to steal it because you can't stand seeing me at the top." She turned to the door, pausing as Philip shouted, "You'll tank us all, Denise. Go public and the stock's done. Your precious empire's dust." Harold added, his voice a growl, "Walk away, or I'll make sure you regret it." She looked back, her smile cold and cutting, her eyes blazing. "I'm not firing you, Philip. I'm letting you drown. And Harold, you don't scare me. The board can decide your lifeboats. I've got work to do." She walked out, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving Philip stammering, Harold seething, the board scrambling. Margaret barking orders, others flipping through the logs, the room a chaos she'd ignited. Downstairs, she called Lena, her voice a low command. "Leak it. Not the photo, just the story. CEO denied entry, uncovers rot. Let it burn. And get me those execs' files. Every name on that list." "On it," Lena said, her grin audible through the line. "This is gonna blow up." "Good," Denise said, stepping outside, the Chicago wind whipping her hair, the sky gray and heavy with coming rain. She wasn't done, not with Philip, not with Harold, not with the system that kept trying to erase her. Tara's note was still in her purse, a small weight against the storm she'd just unleashed. She'd built this empire to stand. Now, she'd make sure it stood for something, something they'd never forget. Omaha hummed outside the suite's window, freight trains groaning through the industrial zone, their horns a low wail that carried over the rooftops, the faint tang of BBQ smoke drifting from old market stalls where pitmasters flipped ribs over glowing coals. The Missouri's chill seeped through the glass, a damp bite that reminded Denise of her first visit here, years back, scouting the site. A vendor in a faded apron had handed her cornbread, still warm, his grin gap-toothed. "You look hungry, hun. On the house." She'd eaten it standing in the lot, the crumbs falling onto her boots, the sweetness grounding her as she sketched the hotel's outline in her mind. A beacon in a city that felt half asleep. In Minneapolis, her past echoed louder, snow burying her boots as she trudged to that hotel job, the wind howling off Lake Minnetonka, her breath fogging in the dark. The lobby radio played Prince, Purple Rain, crackling through static, his voice a tether to her roots, a reminder of home as she balanced the books under Paul's sneer. In St. Paul, the motel's neon sign flickered, vacancy buzzing faintly, the rain drumming the roof as she scribbled her dream on that napkin, her mom's quilt a patchwork of hope in her memory. These places weren't just dots on a map. They were her bones, her blood, the soil where she'd grown this empire. And now, they fueled her fight, a fire no one could douse. The sun dipped below Chicago's skyline as Denise hailed a car back to her hotel. Not a pinnacle, just a quiet spot on the near north side to think, to plan, to breathe. She sat in the back seat, Tara's note in one hand, her phone in the other, the city blurring past, towers of glass and steel, horns blaring, the L train rattling overhead. She wasn't shocked anymore, not by Tara's dismissal, not by Philip's betrayal, not by Harold's knife in her back. She was tired of the endless loop of proving herself, the weight of being unseen, the quiet ache of having to explain her worth. But tiredness wasn't surrender. It was fuel, a slow burn that had carried her from St. Paul's motel to this moment, and it would carry her further still. She thought of every lobby she'd walked into, every room she'd been sized up in, the motel where Marty called her sweetie, the bank where Tom laughed her out, the Dallas pitch where she cried in her car, the Phoenix elevator where she stared down a manager's doubt. Each one a battle, each one a brick in her wall, a wall she'd built high enough to stand on, strong enough to hold her weight. But it wasn't bulletproof, not yet. Tara's smirk, Greg's hesitation, Philip's lies, Harold's greed. They chipped at it, not because they hurt, but because they reminded her how little had changed, how the world still saw her as less until she forced it to see more. Her phone buzzed, a news alert. Harrow Enterprises CEO exposes internal corruption after hotel incident. It was live, spreading like wildfire across X, LinkedIn, every corner of the internet. Headlines screaming, comments piling up, the story ablaze she'd lit. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. The story wasn't about her. It was about everyone who'd ever been dismissed, doubted, or told they didn't belong. Everyone who'd walked into a room and felt the air shift, the eyes narrow, the assumptions snap into place. Her message wasn't in the headlines. It was in her steps, her refusal to bend, her quiet, unrelenting stand. A stand that said, "I'm here, I'm enough, and you don't get to decide otherwise." Then the final twist hit, a gut punch that stole her breath. Another email from the unknown sender, the subject line stark, "He's not alone. It's bigger." Inside a list, 5 names, all execs under Philip, all tied to Tate. Regional managers, finance leads, loyalists she'd trusted with her life. But at the bottom, a 6th, Harold Grayson, board member, Philip's uncle, her first investor, the man who'd shaken her hand in '06 and promised to back her dream. A note followed. Harold's the architect. Philip's the tool. Tate's the muscle. They've been rigging it for years. Stock drops, service failures, all to force a sale. Check the 2018 audit. It's buried there. Attached, a scanned page. An audit from her Denver property. A $500K discrepancy. Philip had blamed on vendor errors Harold had signed off on, and she'd overlooked in the chaos of expansion. Denise's chest tightened, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling as she forwarded it to Lena with a single line. Pull the 2018 audit. Every page. Now. She leaned back, Tara's note crinkling in her hand, the plane's hum replaced by the car's quiet rumble, the city's lights streaking past like comets. Philip was a snake, but Harold was the venom, her mentor, her rock, the man who'd sat at her mom's funeral and squeezed her hand, promising to always have her back. He'd smiled as she rose, applauded her wins, all while sharpening the knife, resenting every step she took past him, every dollar she earned beyond his reach. He'd used Philip as his pawn, Tate as his hammer, and her trust as his leverage, building a trap she'd walked into blind. The car stopped. She stepped out, the note from Tara a small weight in her purse, the wind cold against her face as she looked up at the sky. Gray, heavy, promising rain that would wash the city clean. Philip thought he'd broken her. Harold thought he'd owned her. Tate thought he'd bought her. They were wrong. Dead wrong. She'd built this from nothing, from a napkin in a rainy motel, from a legal pad in a snowy back office, from a binder in a sneering bank. She'd rebuild it from this, from their ashes, their lies, their rot. For herself, for Tara, for Cal, for Marla. For every shadow the world tried to ignore, every voice it tried to silence. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked inside, her voice a whisper to the wind, a vow to the night. You don't need their permission to stand tall. Let them choke on their own surprise when you do. She smiled, not with relief, but with the cold, sharp resolve of a woman who'd just found her next fight, a fight she'd win on her terms, with her hands, her heart, her fire. The door closed behind her, and Denise Harrow started planning, step by step, brick by brick, a reckoning they'd never see coming.